Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. I am Kostas, and I am here again today, as always, joined by my faithful colleague, Andrew.
I am very faithful, Kostas. Thank you for recognizing that.
Indeed. It's my pleasure. And we have yet another interesting topic, I think, here that merits some interesting discussion today. So today we will be talking about how to approach teaching basic Latin sentence translation. And this is an interesting topic, as I said, because, again, one of the things that we aim to do here on this show is to make you aware of things that you might not otherwise give a whole lot of thought or attention to. And, of course, this is certainly a cornerstone, a building block of all Latin teaching. And as interesting as it might be to think of, there are different ways of going about this sometimes. And so we want to illuminate and elucidate those different things and make you think about your own methods and possibly opening up to other things. So with that said, Andrew, what are some of the different approaches for teaching Latin sentence translation?
Well, I think most teachers tend to approach this in pretty much the same way. Mm-hmm. I've talked to a lot of teachers, and you and I have both interviewed a lot of teachers and watched them teach. And most of them do pretty much the same thing. So they will show students how to translate a sentence. They will go through the sentence themselves. And then they will have students translate those sentences and then help them along as they translate the sentence. So it's really kind of teaching by doing or teaching by example most of the time. Mm-hmm. Most of the teachers I've seen use that at least as the base for how they teach Latin sentence translation. But there are some variations on that. And, my preferred method, I think, is a variation on that. So I do teach by example, and I show students what to do. And then I have them do it and help them along as they do that. I do it in that way. But then I supplement that with, what I think I would call the rule method. Of approaching Latin sentence translation, which is to really come back to again and again the basic rules about the structure of a Latin sentence that students need to know. And they're going to be applying those rules again and again.
So how much more complicated, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go on.
I was just going to say, how much more complicated is something like that, depending on where the student is coming from? Because, of course, they all come from different backgrounds. They come from different experiences in their education, their time that they've spent learning grammar or maybe other foreign languages. How much more challenging is that for a student who may have zero background in how to approach a foreign language versus a student who has more experience in it? Does anything change?
It is much more challenging for students who do not have a lot of language or grammar background. Mm-hmm. Those are the students who have the hardest time with Latin in the beginning because they're really learning twice as much as everybody else. So students who have a good grammar background, they will know what a noun is, what a verb is. They'll know what a subject is and a direct object is. That's no problem for them. And these are things you really need to kind of know on the first day of a Latin class. Not necessarily always the first day, but certainly within the first couple of weeks, you're going to touch on all of those, depending on the class. And so if a student already knows that, well, that student is, if it's a 100-yard dash, that student's already on the 50-yard line there. And the other students, are still at the 0-yard line. And so there's a lot more that they have to do. And for those students, sometimes you've got to give them a bit more support. So I normally focus on, I think, what I would call the kind of typical example method where you show and then you help them along, supplemented with what I call the rule method. So really going back again and again to the rules that they have to keep on applying. For the students who have a very hard time in the beginning, these are usually students who do not have a good grammar background. I will use what I call the step method. And this really just means giving the students a step-by-step guide to translating a Latin sentence, which is something I made up years ago. And I made it because there were students who just couldn't handle it otherwise. They eventually got past it. So they eventually got to the point where they could translate a sentence like anyone else, but they really needed it in the beginning because there was just so much they were learning all at once.
Yeah.
And they couldn't hold it all together in their minds in the beginning. I mean, what's your experience with this, Kostas?
Well, that's definitely been something that I've experienced as well. And I was going to say, as far as I'm concerned, or at least as my experience is dictated, again, sort of, and I don't want to be too loosey-goosey with all of this because I don't want to, this is a fine line we have to walk, naturally. We want to have rules. We want to have things that are established. We want to have tried and true methods that we can always go back and rely on. But at the same time, there is a part of this that necessitates that we sort of gear what we do to the student in a small way, if no other way. Not so much that you change your entire approach to things, but not to the point where you're inflexible either. And if there's something like you just mentioned where you were more or less required to come up with this step method for certain students, then we don't want to be averse to doing that either. And I was just going to ask, because I've employed all of these methods that we're talking about at one point or another at various times in teaching or tutoring throughout the years. At what point did you discover that those who were using the step method were ready to sort of graduate from that? What indicated that?
Well, they just stopped using it. It wasn't.
That would work, yeah.
It doesn't happen all together on one day. Mm-hmm. But what normally happens is they would really use it in a meticulous manner for a while. Mm-hmm. You know, really having to read through the whole thing, to look at it, do the next thing, look at it again, do the next thing. And then over time, they just have to look at it less and less until they didn't use it at all. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it was really a crutch. But, you know, a lot of things we do in teaching are crutches that people outgrow. The students outgrow them after a while. But they're important to have in those earlier stages, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to manage it. I mean, I guess it's a little bit like training wheels on a bicycle. Now, I never had training wheels, so I guess there may be different sort of ideas about teaching in the same way there are ideas about how to learn to ride a bicycle.
I was a tricycle person growing up.
What, always? You never learned to ride a bicycle?
It didn't go so well. So eventually I got to the point where I just moved on to other things. But,
right. Well, that's sometimes, I guess, what you have to do.
Yeah.
I know that I think I didn't have training wheels because I'm assuming my parents were just too cheap, probably. They just, why have training wheels? That's ridiculous. Just learn to ride the bicycle. But clearly, in learning to ride a bicycle, at least for me, it was something I had to really work at for a while. It wasn't something that came to me right away. I had to keep on trying. And then there was a moment where it sort of clicked. So I wasn't just immediately falling over, but even though I was a little bit wobbly, I could pedal forward a bit. And then maybe at a certain point I had to put my feet down. And then after that, I could do it, but I had to do it in a circle. I remember this. I couldn't really control it enough, but I could go in one direction in a circle, and then eventually I could do whatever I wanted to.
I ride a stationary bike. Does that count?
Well, it's I think that's a skill as well. You know, to do all that and not go anywhere. That's really a magical thing, and I think maybe that's sort of what many people's relationship with Latin is. So it's something that starts off as an exercise, but then eventually it takes you places.
That is a tremendous analogy.
You can write that down, Kostas.
I will. I will preserve it for all posterity.
Okay, thank you.
But in all seriousness, I'm glad that we're talking about this. It actually gets into another area, specifically when we talk about the step method of doing things. And this is kind of something that is a possible point of contention among Latin teachers, and I fear it may lead to a slight disagreement between the two of us, which would be a first. It's a shock, I know, but we try to keep things spicy.
As I told you before we started recording today, we need to argue more in this podcast. I mean, this is, I think we need to make it more exciting for people.
Things are too genial. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Let's get a little hatred in the mix.
All right. So in terms of the step method, I know that you are a staunch proponent of always looking for the verb first in a Latin sentence. Whereas I expressed to you, again, we were talking before the show, and I mentioned to you that on occasion, again, I have deviated from this, and I go for the subject first sometimes. And you were very, well, I won't speak for you. Go ahead. You jump in here and
you're
express
going
your
to say
outrage.
I was adamant. Yes. About not liking your method.
That's right.
Well, so there are reasons for that. And I understand why teachers often might want to say, and I've seen lots of them do it, might want to say that you should start with the subject because English starts with the subject. So it seems like a nice thing to do for native English speakers. So, the language no longer seems foreign. And you're saying, well, when you translate the Latin sentence, you're going to put the subject first anyway. When you translate it into English, why not get that first, stick it down there first, and then you can move on to the next thing, which is the verb. Just do it in the order of the English sentence. Well, that is fine. But I'm not actually certain that is the most effective or efficient way to translate the sentence. Because as we know, as you and I, Kostas, know, when you are translating a sentence from Latin into English, there may be several nouns in the sentence that could be nominatives.
That is true.
And you may not know right off the bat which one of those is the subject. But if you look at the verb, often the verb will tell you which one of those is the subject because, of course, the subject and the verb have to agree in number. So if a noun, if it is nominative, it could be a nominative form. If it's not the right number, well, you can eliminate that as a possible subject. And what you want to do is, as quickly as possible, eliminate everything that is not the subject so you know what the subject is. If you start with the subject, then I think in a lot of cases you're adding extra steps, more steps than you need. And we need to remember that when beginning students are doing this, an issue every single one of them is going to have is remembering several things at once. They will have to remember several things simultaneously
Mhm.
to effectively translate the sentence. And if the students do it in the way you're talking about, then they're put in a situation where they have to remember more things all at once.
Yeah.
So if they start with the verb, then they know singular or plural. Okay, they're there. They figured out the verb, and now they know subject is either singular or the subject is plural. Then they can look around and they look at one, no. They look at another, no. They look at the third, yes. That's it. If they go in the other direction, then they have to remember all of those words that could be the subject, the gender, number, and case of every single one of them, well, or at least the case and number of every single one of them. And then they have to take those multiple words and apply them to the verb. It just is harder. And for us, it isn't hard. We could do it either way, and it wouldn't make any difference. But for a beginning student, my attitude is you want to simplify things to the extreme. You want to figure out any way to make translating that sentence simpler for the student. Because even though for us it's easy, for them it is quite a task. And it's so difficult that, quite a few students think, boy, am I ever going to get this? I mean, this is a lot to deal with.
Well, I was just going to say, let me just echo what you just said about simplifying everything for the student. And I actually am going to challenge that in a way. But before I do, let's take a quick break for a message from Gray Fox Tutors.
Thanks so much for listening to the Gray Fox Latin Teachers podcast. I'd like to talk for a minute about how you can help sustain all of our free Gray Fox Latin teacher resources, including our conversational Latin textbook, Latin podcasts, Latin resources archives, and conversational Latin Skype workshops for Latin teachers. Gray Fox believes in giving back. We do charge students for tutoring in classes, but because we believe Latin is for everyone and not just the few, we also offer free professional development workshops for teachers. So that we can keep on offering and expanding these opportunities, please consider referring people who need tutoring or are interested in languages beyond your purview. If you have a student whose complicated schedule makes meeting in person with a tutor difficult, please consider referring him or her to Gray Fox. Because our tutors and teachers are located in multiple time zones and all tutoring is done online, there will always be a tutor available at the time you need. If your students are frustrated by tutoring from peers or college students who disappear as soon as midterms start, please consider referring them to Gray Fox. We've been in operation since 2008, employing several dozen elite tutors. We are reliable and always available.
And we're back. And before the break, I teased it by saying I wanted to follow up on that point where you said you wanted to simplify things for the student.
I have to tell you, Kostas, I've been on pins and needles, waiting to find out what your response was going to be to this.
I shall wait. I shall make you wait no longer. And if I haven't already, if we haven't already lost half our audience by this shocking broaching of this topic, by talking about subject first or verb first, and
this is a shocking episode. Yes, the podcast.
It could be termed scandalous, perhaps not. Anyhow, I was going to say you could possibly make the argument that if you are after what is the simplest method of doing something for a student, at least at the outset, initially, perhaps you give in slightly. And if that student, again, this is the part where I was talking about just sort of doing things to accommodate the student. I almost don't like saying that word because you don't want to get lost in what you do. You don't want to become a different person. But if you are noticing that the student is just sort of stuck in the mud on this English word order thing, if they just can't get their minds around it any other way, like you were talking about, the student that caused you to make up these the step method, if you have a student like that, and I've had a few, where they are just married to the idea of I must speak in English word order, then perhaps it's not the worst thing in the world to start by going for the subject for that student, at least initially.
Yeah. So I'm not necessarily against that. Certainly in teaching, you have to be flexible and you have to be ready to adapt to lots of different situations, lots of different students. There's no question about that. I think we're really talking more in generalities here. So kind of the methods that will work for the majority of students. And you brought this up before about how yes, you have to be ready to adapt. I mean, in every episode, I think so far we've talked about students of different ages. Right. So, I mean, that's a major reason why a teacher needs to adapt. Very young students need to be taught in a different way from older students. So students who are under 10 years old have to be taught differently from students who are 12, 13 or more years old. This is what I've seen again and again in my experience. But, returning to what you were talking about there with, the order of translation, what should you tackle first, the subject or the verb? I think this leads us into another topic, and you were kind of alluding to it there. The difference between English and Latin, the sentence structure in English and Latin. Obviously, English has an extraordinarily rigid word order. As languages go, it is quite rigid. Now, there are lots of other languages that are the same. We're in, kind of an era of languages like that with very rigid word orders. So, not as inflected as...
Well, I can just tell you from experience with modern Greek. I mean, modern Greek is an inflected language, but it is far more akin to English in its word order than it ever could be to ancient Greek.
Right. Well, it's a matter of level of inflection, obviously. So, English is inflected to a degree. So it's not as though there's such a thing. Okay, I won't say that. I guess in theory, there could be such a thing as a completely uninflected language and also a completely inflected one. But that's not normally how it works out. But anyway, in teaching Latin, I believe that there should always be a single long-term goal, which is to get students to the point where they really understand the Latin language in an instinctive way.
Yes.
So they're not translating it. They just know what it means. They hear it and they know what it means. And when they want to say something, they just speak it, or they write it, or maybe they read it and they understand it, but it happens immediately because instinctively they just know. In the same way we instinctively know English. If we read something in English, we read it very quickly, and we don't have any trouble understanding what's there. Assuming there isn't some crazy word we've never seen before, we don't have a whole lot of trouble understanding what we've read. Unfortunately, most Latin students aren't in that position, so they have a very hard time, and it's because they haven't broken free of English. And so, I think this is a related point. Even though in the beginning, there's a lot for students to learn, we need to give them as much support as we can. We need to, especially if they're older students, we really need to make it rules-based the way that they approach the language, grammar-based, the way they approach the language, eventually the best students will break free of all that, and will understand that Latin is not English, and that they don't need to have that word order to understand a sentence, whether they're reading it or it's spoken to them. And it could, the elements in the sentence could be in any order, and that's just fine. I mean, that's my goal as a teacher, to get students to that point.
Yeah, no, you make an extremely important point, and this really is sort of the crux of this whole matter. And I will be upfront with my students about this. When I teach a class, I will tell them, if I don't tell them at the very beginning of the class, and certainly as we're progressing through learning how to translate sentences, I will just be very honest and upfront with them, and I'll say, the idea is for you to get to the point where you can look at a Latin sentence and you can process it as a Roman would have processed Latin. Now, of course, that takes time. And then their next question will be, well, how long does that take? I mean, how long did it take you to get to the point where you are? And I'll say, well, that can vary. It can take years. It could take less than that, depending on how you approach things. But that's always the goal. And I think we want to make it clear here that no matter what particular method you employ, whether it's any of the three methods we cited in the last segment, or whatever variation perhaps of the step method you might use, whether you choose to go for a subject first or a verb first, the goal, the long-term goal, is to get to the point where you can look at a sentence and just take it for what it is and sort of drink it in. And any debate we're having about which one is better to do that, which way should you go for first, is aimed at getting towards that goal.
Mm-hmm. Well, we always kind of come back to this, but, obviously if that's the goal, and, I really think it should be, I really think that students should be trying to get to the point where they can use the language in a fluent way. To get there, you have to break free of translation. So you need to really use the language in a conversational context. You need to have that constant practice with understanding a sentence in order as it's spoken to you, no matter what the order is of the words in the sentence, and then composing sentences in response. And when you do have that practice, and it's no different from any other language. I mean, every other language is this way. I mean, if you're learning Spanish or you're learning French, this is what you would do. Yeah. That is the way to really get to a high level in the language. But of course, we're talking about a long journey here. So you got to start with baby steps, and you have to learn the basics, and you need to learn the basics well, and then you need to build on that. And if you get your fundamentals down and you know them well, then you're really in a position to take it to the next level and really use the language as a language. I mean, but, Kostas, maybe you disagree with me.
I wish I did. But I think our disagreements have come to an end for at least this week.
Right.
And sadly, I'm right back in your corner on this one.
Well, one of these days we're going to have somebody on the show who is not going to agree with that.
Yes.
And will have a lot of negative things to say about using the Latin language conversationally. There are plenty of people like that out there.
Fun times coming up. Yes.
Right. So we can look forward to that. And I do really like having those conversations. I think these are things we need to talk about and we need to deal with. I think that one of the biggest issues Latin teachers have is that they tend to be very isolated from each other. Yeah. And so frequently these conversations don't happen. And I think because of that, there is a tendency for ideas about instruction in Latin to kind of move and change very slowly. Or if they do change and there's a different idea, there's this tendency for there to be this kind of slow motion clash between the two. But it often takes a long time to work itself out because we just don't talk to each other enough. And I would really like for that to change. I would like there to be much more communication among Latin teachers, and for us to learn from each other. I mean, I know that I have a lot to learn. I mean, I've done my best, but I know that there are many more things I could know. I could certainly be a better teacher than I am. I've worked very hard at it, but there's always lots of room for improvement. Coast,
absolutely, yeah. No,
on the other hand, yeah.
No, I was going to say that's the bottom line. I think you've always got to be open to learning, and you've always got to be willing to explore new horizons and sort of come out of your shell, maybe if that's the way you've been teaching, and just work. I hate all these cliches, but if they fit, why not? Work outside the box, so to speak, and just be willing to do different things. And of course, that's something that we try to provide here: is different perspectives on things. Things that you may not have thought of before, or if you have thought of them, maybe in a more in-depth look at those things to determine whether you wish to keep doing them or if maybe another approach is perhaps better.
Right. And, we love to get feedback. And, I'm just going to make a little plug here. A great way to give us feedback if you're a Latin teacher is to join our Facebook group, the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Forum. Please find us on Facebook. Join. You have to just answer a little question to prove that you're a Latin teacher because it is a closed group. But we'd love to have you, and we'd love for you to join our ongoing online conversation.
Yes. Okay. Well, I was so entranced by that.
Right. Well,
I temporarily dropped off. Sorry.
I also find the Facebook group entrancing.
No, in all seriousness, it's a great group of people that have joined. There's some famous people there, some perhaps less famous people there, in this particular space, in this realm, and we do try to keep it lively, and we do come up with different topics which we hope are interesting for discussion purposes and also informative, and of course. It's always good to belong to a community, especially, with Latin teachers who are not always among their own as much as perhaps they would like.
Right. And it's a great way to meet the two of us. So, this is one of those times when you can meet your heroes.
Well, I don't want to disappoint anyone, but.
No. All right. So I think that we're about at the end of the half hour.
Yes.
Costas, as always, it was great talking to you. Please subscribe to our podcast if you haven't already. And in fact, the step-by-step translation guide, which we talked about, you can actually download that from the archives section of the Gray Fox website. So please check that out. We'll talk again next week, Costas.
I will talk to you.
Okay.
I don't know that I'll have anything interesting to say, but I will talk.
Right. We'll ramble a bit, as always. But until next time, everybody, it was great to have you with us. Bye-bye.